The first story, Voices in Reactor 4. When the explosion tore through Reactor 4, chaos engulfed the Chernobyl facility. The world believed it was a tragic accident, a catastrophic failure of Soviet engineering. But those who were there knew differently. Igor Kovalenko, a veteran technician, was among the few who survived that night, though he often wished he hadn't. It started with the whispers. Amid the blaring alarms and the suffocating heat, Igor heard them, a faint murmuring coming from the reactor chamber. At first, he thought it was his co-workers shouting over the noise, but the voices didn't sound familiar. They were fragmented, unnatural, like static breaking through a radio. "Help us," one voice whispered. "We didn't mean for this," another cried. Shaking it off as stress, Igor focused on evacuating the area, but the whispers stayed with him. Even when he was miles away from the facility, the voices seemed to echo in his mind. Weeks later, after the initial panic subsided, Igor was called back to assist with the cleanup. The reactor site was a nightmare: melted metal, scorched concrete, and radiation levels that would kill a man in seconds. But amidst the destruction, Igor noticed something strange. The air near Reactor 4 felt alive. As he approached the core's containment chamber, his Geiger counter spiked wildly, but he pushed on. Deep inside, he found something the official reports hadn't mentioned: a strange, blackened substance clinging to the reactor walls. It pulsed faintly, emitting an eerie glow. "Do you see us now?" a voice whispered, louder this time. Igor froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The shadows around him began to move, forming shapes, figures that flickered like static on a screen. They weren't human anymore. Their bodies were translucent, their faces twisted in agony. What are you?" Igor stammered, backing away. "We were the first," one figure said, its voice fractured and hollow. Trapped in the experiment, determined to uncover the truth, Igor began digging through classified documents. Late one night, in a forgotten corner of the facility archives, he found a report stamped with a word that sent chills down his spine: experiment. The document detailed a top-secret Soviet project conducted months before the meltdown. Scientists had been testing a revolutionary energy source extracted from deep within the Earth. The substance, dubbed Element 72, promised limitless power but came with horrifying side effects. Workers exposed to it began hearing voices, seeing shadowy figures, and behaving erratically. Several had vanished without explanation. The experiment had been abandoned, but traces of Element 72 remained in Reactor 4. When the meltdown occurred, it released the substance and whatever it had awakened. Haunted by what he'd learned, Igor returned to Reactor 4 one final time. The site was now sealed off, guarded by military patrols, but under the cover of night, he slipped through the perimeter and descended into the ruins. The air inside the reactor chamber felt heavier than before, thick with a metallic tang. As he approached the core, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Destroy it," they demanded. "Free us." In the center of the chamber, Igor found the source of the voices, the pulsating mass of element -72. It looked alive, writhing like a creature in pain. The figures emerged again, surrounding him. This time, he recognized their faces: engineers, scientists, and workers who had disappeared during the initial experiment. "You must end this," one of them pleaded, their form flickering like a dying light. Summoning his courage, Igor activated the explosives he'd brought with him. As the countdown began, the figures stepped back, their ghostly faces softening into relief. "Thank you," they whispered, just as the chamber was consumed by fire. In the aftermath, the Soviet government claimed the explosion was a simple aftershock of the original disaster. But the strange phenomenon near Reactor 4 ceased, and the whispers were never heard again. Igor's name was erased from official records. His heroism buried with the truth. But those who ventured too close to the ruins swore they could still feel it. A presence in the air, faint whispers echoing through the silence, as if the shadows of Reactor 4 had never truly left. The second story, The Silent Watchers. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet government swiftly contained the narrative, assuring the world that the explosion at Reactor 4 was merely the result of a botched experiment. What was not said, however, was the deeper, darker truth buried beneath the rubble. There were whispers, unconfirmed stories, and unsettling rumors that suggested something far worse had transpired beneath the veil of secrecy. A hidden experiment gone wrong, one that had far-reaching consequences that no one could have imagined. A few weeks after the explosion, a group of Soviet soldiers was tasked with securing the exclusion zone. Their mission was clear: prevent anyone from entering the contaminated area surrounding Reactor 4 and ensure that no one could uncover the truth. The military made it clear that they were to avoid any unnecessary contact with the surroundings, but in the deep, shadowed corridors of the reactor building, something far worse than radiation was waiting. One night during his patrol, a soldier named Alexei noticed something strange. As he stood watch near Reactor 4, he glimpsed a faint movement through the cracks in the reactor's sealed concrete walls. At first it appeared to be just a trick of the light, but as he looked closer he saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, with skin that looked unnaturally pale and glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't human, at least, not in the way Alexei understood. The figure was standing motionless in the distance, watching him. Alexei blinked, and the figure was gone. His heart raced. He rubbed his eyes and tried to tell himself that the radiation had gotten to him, that the stress of the situation had played tricks on his mind. But the next night it happened again, and the night after that. It wasn't just one figure anymore. They appeared in groups, standing still in the distance, always watching, always silent. And sometimes they moved in unnatural ways, like their bodies were not meant to bend and stretch the way humans do. They would step in and out of view as if they were phasing through the walls themselves. The whispers started soon after, soft, incomprehensible murmurs that seemed to drift through the air around the soldiers, voices that would call their names in the dead of night. At first, the soldiers laughed it off, attributing it to the stress and the fear of being in such a dangerous, radiation-soaked environment. But as the days turned into weeks, more and more soldiers began to hear the voices, each claiming they could feel their names being whispered in the darkness, sometimes in a soothing tone, other times in an urgent, panicked plea. One soldier, Mikhail, went missing without a trace. He was last seen walking toward the reactor building during his shift, but he never returned. His fellow soldiers searched for hours but found nothing, no sign of struggle, no footprints, no evidence of what had happened to him. His disappearance was chalked up to the danger of the contaminated area, but the remaining soldiers grew uneasy. As the weeks passed, more soldiers began to feel the effects of the whispers. Some reported seeing the figures more clearly, now more like shadows lurking in the periphery of their vision, always moving just out of reach. Others reported hearing a chilling sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping that came from deep within the reactor itself. The strange phenomena weren't just confined to the soldiers. Even those tasked with monitoring the area's radiation levels reported irregularities in the equipment, as though the radiation wasn't the only force at work. Then, one night, things took a terrifying turn. Alexei and his comrades were ordered to investigate a breach in the perimeter near Reactor 4. As they approached the damaged section, the air seemed to grow thick, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. The shadows seemed to grow longer and more oppressive, and then they saw them, figures, standing still in the middle of the wreckage, their bodies unnaturally long and their skin pale as death. Their eyes glowed faintly, and they were not looking at the soldiers but at something else, something deeper within the reactor. In a daze, Alexei stumbled toward the figures, drawn by an invisible force. He reached out a hand, but before he could touch one of them, the figures vanished into the walls of the reactor. The temperature around him dropped sharply, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to fall silent. When Alexei came to, he was alone. His comrades were nowhere to be found. He called for them, but only the echoes of his voice responded. He returned to the military base, telling his superiors what had happened, but they dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by exposure to high levels of radiation. They insisted that the stress of the disaster and the isolation was messing with his mind. But Alexei knew what he had seen, and he wasn't the only one. As time passed, more soldiers began to report similar experiences. The figures, the whispers, the unshakable feeling of being watched. They were all too real. And yet, every time a soldier tried to investigate further, they were pulled away by higher-ups, told to stay away from Reactor 4 at all costs. The military kept the truth hidden for years. The voices, the figures, and the strange occurrences were all written off as the result of radiation poisoning and trauma. The soldiers who spoke out were either silenced or dismissed, and the official story remained that the Chernobyl disaster was an accident, nothing more. But there were rumors. Some believed the true cause of the disaster was not a failed reactor test, but an experiment gone wrong, something far more secret and sinister than anyone could imagine. A former KGB agent, years after the event, leaked a confidential document that suggested the truth. The document spoke of an unholy project, one that involved human subjects, mutations, and experiments designed to unlock the power of the atom. The explosion at Reactor 4 had not been a failure, it had been a cover-up, an attempt to contain the consequences of a project that had altered the very fabric of reality itself. The soldiers who had witnessed the strange figures were never heard from again, their names lost in the chaos of the aftermath. But some believe that, to this day, the silent watchers still remain in the ruins of Reactor 4, waiting for someone to uncover the truth, and to bear witness to the horrors that still lurk there in the shadows beyond the reach of human understanding. The third story, The Unseen Message. After the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet government went to great lengths to erase all traces of the catastrophe, controlling the narrative and downplaying the true extent of the event. However, there were those who believed that the radioactive catastrophe had not only caused physical destruction, but also something far more unsettling, an otherworldly presence, one that used the disaster as a way to communicate with those who were willing to listen. In the months following the explosion, strange phenomena began to surface. While many believed the entire area was cursed or haunted by the spirits of the victims, some experienced far more personal encounters. One of those was a man named Yuri, a journalist who had long been skeptical of supernatural claims. He had spent years covering stories about military operations and state secrets, but nothing could have prepared him for what he uncovered in the aftermath of Chernobyl. Yuri had been part of a small team that was sent to document the cleanup efforts. The task was simple: take photos, gather reports, and write a piece about the recovery process. The government, eager to move on from the disaster, wanted to paint a picture of resilience. But as Yuri's team made their way through the remains of the reactor, they began to encounter odd occurrences that were impossible to explain away. One evening, while Yuri was walking through the abandoned halls of the power plant, his flashlight flickered out. He cursed under his breath, fumbling in the dark to replace the batteries. But as he struggled, he noticed something in the distance, an unnatural glow. It wasn't the faint greenish light of radiation, nor was it the normal flash of a malfunctioning bulb. This was a steady, pulsating light emanating from a narrow, previously unnoticed hallway. Curiosity overcame him, and despite the warnings from his colleagues to stay away from certain sections, Yuri ventured down the corridor. The light grew brighter as he walked, but when he reached the end of the hall, he found nothing except an old, dusty control panel that appeared to have been untouched for years. The light, however, was coming from behind it. Hesitant, Yuri pried open the panel, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, Yuri found an old, battered notebook. The pages were yellowed and fragile, and the handwriting inside was barely legible, as if written in a hurry. The notes chronicled what appeared to be an experiment, one that was far more disturbing than any government document he had ever seen. It described a plan to use the power of the reactor to manipulate time itself. to send consciousness through the fabric of reality in order to contact other dimensions. The entry spoke of the scientists' growing desperation, their warnings of strange occurrences happening within the reactor's core, voices, visions, and flashes of things that shouldn't exist. Yuri was disturbed by the contents, but also intrigued. The final entry in the notebook was the most chilling. "We've made contact. The entity has spoken. It is not of this world, and it demands that we listen." As he read those words, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A faint whisper filled the air, low and incomprehensible, like a voice from the depths of space. Yuri turned around in a panic, but there was no one behind him. The voice grew louder, and then, unexpectedly, the walls around him seemed to shimmer, as if the very fabric of reality was rippling. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his head, as though his mind was being pulled in multiple directions at once. He stumbled back, clutching his skull, unable to process what was happening. The whispers grew more insistent, and the room around him seemed to stretch, the walls bending and twisting in unnatural ways. He could hear the voice clearer now, but it was no longer speaking in words. It was communicating directly with his mind. "Should have never come," the voice said, not through sound, but through thought itself. "You've awakened what you cannot understand. The reactor was never just a machine. It was a doorway, and now you have opened it." Before Yuri could react, everything went dark. When Yuri came to, he was no longer in the reactor. He was lying on the floor of an abandoned building, disoriented and confused. The notebook had vanished. His head throbbed with a lingering sense of dread, and when he tried to stand, his body felt weak and unsteady. He could barely remember how he had gotten there, let alone what had happened in the reactor building. The following days were a blur. Yuri couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him, something that had followed him back from the reactor. He began to experience vivid dreams, each one more disturbing than the last. Visions of the reactor, of twisted, monstrous shapes, of otherworldly landscapes that defied comprehension. In every dream, he could hear that voice, growing stronger, growing closer. It wasn't just in his head, it was a part of him now. Determined to understand what had happened, Yuri tried to return to the reactor site, but when he arrived, the area had been sealed off. The government had declared the site a no-go zone, and any attempts to enter were met with resistance. There were rumors that certain sections of the area were being bulldozed, that any remaining evidence of what had transpired was being erased. But Yuri knew better. He had felt it, the presence, the entity, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there waiting, watching. Months later, a mysterious package arrived at Yuri's apartment. Inside, he found a single photograph. It was a picture of Reactor 4, taken from a distance. But what made the photograph so chilling was the figure standing in the foreground, tall, dark, and faceless, as if it had been blurred out of reality itself. It was the same shape he had seen in his visions, the same figure that had haunted him since that night in the reactor. The note attached simply read, "It's not over." Yuri never spoke of the events to anyone again. His career as a journalist came to a halt, and he disappeared from public life. The government's story of the disaster remained the official account, and the truth of what had happened inside Reactor 4 remained locked away. But for Yuri, the presence from the reactor never left him. It lingered in the corners of his mind, waiting for the day when he would be called to open the door once again. The fourth story, The Forgotten Survivor. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, the world was left to grapple with the devastating consequences of one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. But there were some who believed that Chernobyl had left behind more than just radiation. It had left behind something far more dangerous, something that had been lost to time. Olga, a former KGB agent, had been assigned to the Chernobyl exclusion zone just weeks after the explosion. She was part of a covert operation, one that was never officially documented, and her mission was clear: erase all traces of the disaster and ensure that no one outside the government knew the full extent of the truth. For years, she carried out her duties without question. quietly removing the evidence that the world would never see. But even Olga wasn't prepared for the day she discovered what had been hidden deep within the zone. It began when she was ordered to investigate an abandoned research facility not far from Reactor 4. The building had been part of a secret project, one that was directly linked to the disaster. It was here that they had been conducting unauthorized experiments on animals, trying to understand the effects of radiation on living creatures. But as Olga and her team arrived at the site, something felt off. The air was thick, charged with a strange energy that seemed to hum through the walls. The building, once a sterile and controlled environment, now stood eerily still. Inside, they found signs of recent activity. There were fresh footprints in the dust, strange markings on the walls, and equipment that had been hastily abandoned. But it was in the heart of the facility that Olga stumbled upon something that would change her life forever. In a small, isolated room at the back of the building, Olga found a lone survivor. It was a man, emaciated and gaunt, barely clinging to life. His skin had an unnatural pallor, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, but there was something otherworldly about him. Despite the decay of his body, his mind was still sharp, and his presence was unsettling. The survivor, who introduced himself as Dmitri, claimed to have been part of the research team that had been working on the project when the explosion occurred. He was the only one left. Everyone else had died or disappeared. But the most disturbing part of his story was the claim that he hadn't just survived the disaster, he had been changed by it. Dmitri spoke of an experiment that had gone wrong, one that had been designed to test the limits of human endurance under extreme radiation. The researchers had subjected themselves to prolonged exposure, believing they could unlock the secrets of human survival in the face of the unknown. But something had gone wrong. Instead of succumbing to the radiation, Dmitri and the others had been altered, twisted into something else entirely. Dmitri spoke of a transformation, a merging of consciousness with the reactor itself. The accident had not only released radioactive particles, it had somehow opened a rift, allowing the minds of the scientists to become one with the very fabric of the reactor. As Dmitri spoke, Olga's skepticism grew, but there was something about his eyes, something that unsettled her. It was as though he wasn't entirely human anymore. His words were disjointed, as if he was struggling to piece together his own thoughts. He spoke of whispers in his mind, of visions of impossible landscapes, and of the reactor itself, which had become a living, breathing entity in its own right. He claimed that he could feel the presence of the reactor, hear its thoughts, and that it was calling to him. When Olga asked him what had happened to the others, Dmitri's answer sent a chill down her spine. He said that the others had not died. They had been absorbed by the reactor, their consciousnesses trapped within its core. They had become part of the machine, and now the reactor was trying to bring him back. It was trying to pull him into its depths. Olga didn't know what to make of Dmitri's words. She had heard rumors of strange experiments and whispered accounts of those who had been changed by the disaster, but she had never believed them. Yet standing before her was a man who was clearly not the same as he once had been. He was no longer entirely human, no longer entirely alive. He was something else, something that was tied to the reactor in ways she couldn't understand. That night, after her team left the research facility, Olga began to feel the effects of Dmitri's presence. It started as a subtle unease, a feeling that something was wrong in the air. But as the days passed, it grew stronger. She would wake in the middle of the night, her mind filled with images of the reactor, of flashes of light, of the buzzing hum of the power plant. She felt as though something was calling to her, something deep within the earth, something that had been awakened by the explosion. Olga tried to ignore it at first. She kept up her duties, continuing to carry out the mission she had been assigned. But the more she worked, the more she began to notice strange occurrences. Items in her room would be moved, doors would creak open by themselves, and she began to hear faint whispers, just like Dmitri had described. The whispers were soft at first, like a distant voice in the wind, but they soon grew louder, clearer. They were speaking in a language she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, as though someone or something was trying to communicate with her. One evening, as Olga sat in her room alone, the whispers grew unbearably loud. She could hear them coming from the walls themselves, and it felt as though the very structure of the building was alive, breathing, pulsing with a strange energy. It was then that she realized the truth. Dmitri had not been lying. The reactor had become more than just a machine. It had become a gateway, a conduit to something beyond human comprehension. And it was calling to her. Terrified, Olga rushed to the facility's control room, desperate to find answers. She reviewed the old documents, the ones she had been forbidden to read. It was then that she found the hidden records, the ones that had been sealed away for years. They spoke of the true nature of the reactor's experiment, an attempt to breach the boundaries between life and death, between reality and the unknown. The explosion had not been an accident. It had been the catalyst for something far worse, something that no one had anticipated. The reactor had become a prison, trapping the consciousness of those who had worked within it. And now it was trying to expand, to pull more souls into its grasp. It was alive, and it was hungry. In the days that followed, Olga could feel herself slipping, her grip on reality weakening. She could hear the voices calling to her growing stronger with each passing moment. She knew that she was no longer alone, that the reactor had found her, just as it had found Dmitri. It was only a matter of time before it would claim her, before she would be pulled into the depths of the machine, to join the countless others who had been lost to its insatiable hunger. Olga never returned to the exclusion zone. Her disappearance was marked as a casualty of the cleanup efforts, a victim of the radiation, but those who knew her best whispered that she had been taken, that she had become one of the forgotten survivors, the souls lost to the reactor, trapped forever in its dark embrace. And so, the Chernobyl disaster was not just a tragedy, it was the beginning of something far worse. A gateway had been opened, and the forgotten souls of the reactor still lingered, waiting, watching, and calling to anyone who dared to listen.